Hello, viewers. I am Lesbian Jesus, and today I will be reading a fanfic. If you're wondering where the FanFic Critic is, she's not home right now, and I'm taking advantage of that. You're probably wondering why a goddess such as myself is reading such amateur works of literature. Well, I got bored, and I also got curious. Besides, today's fanfic is very erotic, if you know what I mean. So let's not waste any time. The fanfic is called LustKlock by Lenny G. It's rated M, it's in English, it's romance, it's Squeezagar and Toki W, and has 5 reviews, and is complete. And forgive me if I pronounce things wrong. Yes, I may be a goddess, but that doesn't mean I can pronounce things perfectly. Especially seeing English is the best language I know and not whatever these names are in. So let's not waste any time. A.N. This story was wrote. Something tells me the grammar there is not good. I think they mean to say the story was written. That makes more sense, so let's read it like that. This story was written for a certain friend of mine, Miss Brenda, who's been a great inspiration to me throughout the past year or so. If it had not been for her, I would have wrote this fanfic. I never would have wrote this fanfic, forgive me. Or even heard of Metalocalypse. Thank you, Brenda, with little weird happy faces. Also, they have like a comma or something. No, they have a weird punctuation mark after the word fanfic. I'm beginning to wonder if English is not this person's first language. Toki moaned as he was shoved down on the bed by his blonde counterpart. Squeezagar smirked through full lips as he crawled on top of his younger bandmate. The two Scandinavian men continued to kiss through moans, a small amount of saliva lightly coating their lips. Toki let out a trembling sigh as Squeezagar pulled back from their kiss, a grin plastered on his face. Gently, he slid a pale hand up Toki's shirt, rubbing it over the tanned abs and up further on his chest. The Norwegian boy let out a small whimper and moaned past his lips as gently one of his nipples was pinched and tweaked, hardening it. The Swede leaned down and started to twist and nibble at the sensitive nub, making Toki cry out as he spread his legs and gently clutched onto the blonde head of hair. Squeezagar pulled back a small string of saliva on his lips that soon broke and ran his pale hands down Toki's side and hips. The brunette instinctively buckled his hip forwards, a certain something begging to be stimulated by the skilled hands. Said hands found their way down to his own skull belt. Apparently, he had been able to remove his shirt in a split second, which led Toki to believe the fact that had obviously been more experienced, and unbuckled it. And if people say you cannot remove a shirt in a split second, oh, you can. Trust me, I should know. The Norwegian wiped a small pool of saliva from his lip, gently brushing away some of his brunette hair from his reddened cheeks, and removed his own shirt. He had started to undo his own pants, but his hands were quickly swatted away from the zipper and button of his jeans by Squeezagar, who took it upon himself to go as slow as possible to tease his bandmate. He undid the button and leaned down, grabbed the zipper with his teeth, and pulled it down to the crook where the metal zipper met the fabric. Toki cried out and trembled, his erection clearly visible through the jeans, and aching with need to be stimulated or touched in some way. Squeezagar only grinned at the reaction. It was obvious that Toki was not only a virgin, but he had also never touched himself. Wow, what restraint. Too bad this person's a male, because I would love to have fun with him if he was a female. Please, Squeezagar. Toki broke the silence with a begging plead. Touch me. He whined out the last part. The smirk widened on the Suede's face as he tucked his fingers in the dark gray jeans of his fellow guitarist and jerked them down to his ankles, taking care to toss off the boots as well, then quickly discarding the boxers that had to be constricting to the Norwegian's manhood, making said Norwegian wince slightly as the hem of his underwear tugged at the penis as the clothing was removed. Skisgar now smirked, a Cheshire-like cat-like grin, as he stared at the boy's length. It was a good size, not as big as his own, mind you, but still decent, especially considering Toki's age. Skisgar, what ails you? The brunette was cut off by a scream as his erection was engulfed by the warmth of the Suede's mouth. Skisgar hummed blissfully around the organ in his mouth, sending vibrations down it and causing Toki's legs to tremble from the pleasure. Almost immediately, he felt semen rushing up his length, but forced himself to hold it in, not wanting to be teased by premature ejaculation should Skisgar ever tell. In the Suede's mind, however, he tried to act as professional as possible, since it was his first time sucking off another man. Judging from his bandmate's reaction, he was doing pretty well. Stokey started to cry out as he balled the sheets in his fist. His face was red, and veins were bulging in his muscles from the strain to stop himself from releasing. His legs started to rise and roughly kick the bed, not hitting Skisgar, but annoying him a tad. Toki cried out louder and louder as he attempted to stop himself, but started to lose it when he felt the Suede's tongue circling the slit and smearing the pre-semen. The Norwegian cursed and yelled out in mixed English and Norwegian, but was soon silenced by a scream as his seed spewed out. Skisgar first attempted to keep his mouth on the boy's member, but pulled back as soon as a salty taste of semen landed on his tongue. Toki slammed his head down on the pillow, panting heavily in an attempt to catch his breath from the force of the orgasm. Skisgar leaned down and kissed his fellow guitarist, a small taste of semen on his lips. Skisgar, Toki panted out, catching the blond man's attention. What does we do's now? The Suede couldn't help but grin stupidly, amused by how naive Toki was. Do I's do's it to you's now? Skisgar chuckled at the comment. Only if you's wants to's, he teased. Toki shook his head, almost as soon as the statement was uttered. Don't you mean uttered with an ED? Fearing that he might possibly injure his jaw attempting to please the other Scandinavian. I am's teasing yous, the Swede assured while leaning down to once more kiss Toki. Now that the thought of receiving oral sex in return had awakened in his head, he realized just how much his erection had to be aching still confined inside his pants. He finally managed to pull his pants down to his ankles, kicked off his boots as the rest of his clothing fell to the floor. Toki felt his heart sink and his face heat up at the sight of the Skisgar's own penis. No wonder women loved him. Skisgar had already prepared to plunge his length into Toki's twitching anus, until he remembered that the younger guitarist was, in fact, a virgin. The blond man placed one of his own fingers in his mouth, wet them with his tongue, and circled it at Toki's entrance. The Norwegian yelped out in surprise and tried to push Skisgar's hand away. Skisgar, what am's you doings? He gasped. The Swede simply kissed the confused man beneath him and continued to prod and tease the clenched-up hole. This am's what we will be's doing next, he muttered, and started to nibble and suck at the sensitive flesh on Toki's neck, attempting to make a hickey. The brunette's eyes fluttered shut as he decided to let Skisgar do whatever he wanted. After all, he was the expert, so to speak. The older man continued his previous actions, slowly prodding and slipping a finger inside. To his surprise, the texture of the bandmate's anus was surprisingly smooth, then got more rigid as he placed his finger in farther. Toki's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't been expecting that, a slight burning feeling from his anus being stretched. Toki wrapped his arms around the blond man's smaller frame, crying out as he felt his southern regions being probed and prodded. His breathing sped up through clenched teeth as he felt a very faint feeling of pleasure slowly starting to rise. Sadly, though, the pleasure escaped him as Gisgar withdrew his fingers. Toki laid on the bed, brunette hair spread out about him, sweat making his hair stick uncomfortably to his body. Gisgar sat up and propped himself on his knees. Apparently, he had pulled a bottle of lubricants. I may not be the expert when it comes to this thing, but if it's a single bottle, why is there an S at the end of lubricant? You should either say a bottle of lubricant or several bottles of lubricants. Out of nowhere, and was currently coating his erection with it. Once finished, he tossed the bottle carelessly aside and flipped his blonde hair out of his eyes. The Swede spread his partner's legs and glanced down at the twitching hole. He positioned himself and slowly started to slip the bulbous head of his penis, the heat radiating off of Toki's asshole almost immediately warming down the shaft. Toki gasped and held his breath, the slight lack of oxygen making a new feeling more bearable, the mistake lying in the need to breathe as he released his breath. The Norwegian boy let out a choking cry as the pain of his nether regions being stretched out and spread across a great amount of discomfort. Gisgar leaned down over Toki and kissed along his cheek down his jawbone. The brunette almost immediately wrapped his arms around his counterpart's torso and neck, jerking his body closer and panting in his ear. The Swede attempted to move his member in deeper, but immediately regretted it as he felt Toki grab fistfuls of wavy blonde hair and tugged at it. Slowly, Toki's grip loosened as he attempted through clenched teeth to relax his ever-tightening asshole. Gisgar waited patiently and tried to calm the man beneath him by placing small kisses all down his cheeks and neck. Toki's eyes shot open for a moment as he looked down. Gisgar, ja? The Swede muttered while gently nuzzling into Toki's neck. You am's speaking's really's nice, ja? So? I ain't used to's it. The Norwegian showed a small smile as he laid back, just about ready to let Gisgar continue fucking him. Yous can move now, he muttered softly. Gisgar nodded as he slowly continued to press his penis inside until it was halfway in. Toki bit his lower lip as he could feel his toes curl from the feeling. The Swede managed to lean down and gently draw his tongue around one of the sensitive nipple buds on Toki's chest, after having to uncomfortably bend his spine. Just one attempt at distracting him from the pain. He then slid a hand down and gently brushed his fingers against the patch of hair that lay directly above the younger man's slick member, which he quickly took in his hand and stroked it. Toki panted and winced through mixed feelings of pleasure and pain as his penis was jerked and rubbed while friction was being made inside of him as Gisgar had started to gently thrust. Slowly pulling himself out, then back in with more speed, these actions continued as Toki had clutched onto the back of his pillow he had been propped up against and turned his head, sweat becoming more and more visible on his body as he held his breath for longer than usual, then released it. The actions weren't entirely painful anymore, or unbearable for that matter. However, said actions were just a tad uncomfortable. Suddenly, the brunette raised his hips out of impulse and let out a scream as he felt Gisgar shove inside him completely, his groin pressed hard against Toki's arse, while his organ lay buried deep inside. Gisgar suddenly straightened his spine and tossed his head back, blonde hair falling off his shoulders and running down his back, along with a deep groan of his throat. the Norwegian boy began to writhe underneath the slightly smaller man above him, while also trying to catch his breath. He let out a yell, at first attempting to swear in his native tongue, but found a yelp instead, and felt the Swedish man proceeding to pull himself out and slam right back in, which in turn made Toki's body jump as he jerked upward from the force of the action, slowly picking up speed. By now, the only noises heard in the room and echoing throughout the halls were strings of garbled English, Norwegian, English, Swedish, the slight squeamish squishing sound of the Swede's penis thrusting in and out of the now moist area, and the springs of the bed creaking in protest of pleasure being put on it. Toki managed to wrap his legs around Skiskar's waist, or rather on his back, while his arms made their way around his neck, pulling him down close. The Swede's thrusting didn't decrease in the slightest. Obviously, he had become an expert on multitasking of this altitude. He had leaned down, blonde hair curtaining over the two Scandinavian faces, and kissing him. The kiss was awkward to say the least, mainly due to the mildly violent movements, which caused their teeth to slam together during the kiss. They didn't mind, though, as the two foreign men could feel their climaxes slowly heating up in their groins. Toki let out one last loud scream, as if he had intended to block out any other sound there might have been in the world, as a series of violent spasms waved through his body and globs of semen shot out from the engorged tip of his penis. On instinct, his anus had clenched up tightly and squeezed Skiskar's own member. The Swede grunted and groaned out as his own seed spewed out. A minor thought passed through his mind, one that made him chuckle under his breath at how true it was. Of all the women, and on rare occasion men, despite all their ages, Toki was the tightest thing Skiskar had ever slammed his erection in. Finally, the two Scandinavians fell on the bed, Skiskar laying on top of Toki. The two were uncomfortable. The sweat on their bodies were making their hair and the sheets stick to them. Both of them kicked the sheets off in an attempt to cool down. Toki gathered his hand behind him and tossed it lazily on the pillow, the brunette hair looking quite beautiful as it glistened with perspiration. Skiskar flipped his blonde hair behind him, a small grin forming on Toki's face, and laid down. The two scooted as close together as they could without being intimate. "I loves yous, Skiskar," Toki muttered as he nuzzled his head into the lead guitarist's chest while gently scratching his own Fu Manchu. "Eyes, Skiskar hesitantly placed a hand at Toki's mid-back, rubbing gently. "I'm's fond of yous too." The Norwegian looked up at the blonde-haired man, who couldn't help but grin at the small pout on Toki's lips, and stated in a stern voice, "Says it." "Says what?" "Say yous loves me." Skiskar shook his head. "Why's not? It ain't brutal to admit having feelings for each other," Skiski explained through jarbled English. The brunette leaned in close. "I be's promising dat I won't tells nobodies." Skiskar still refused to answer. "Fine." Toki pouted and rolled over, facing away from him. The Swede sat up and exhaled boredly. Glancing over at his Gibson, he decided to play. He mindlessly strummed at the strings at fast pace, as was normal for him. Fingers continued to strum non-stop for what he assumed was a half an hour. He hadn't come up with anything new. But then again, he didn't really need it right now. LustKlock wasn't currently working on any new albums, so whenever he picked up a guitar, it was out of boredom. The Swede glanced over and jumped as he noticed Toki's naked body still laying on his bed. He was surprised that the boy hadn't left yet. However, after examining the silence, he knew that he was now asleep. And from the look of small goosebumps forming on his arms, he was cold as well. Skiskar inhaled and exhaled deeply as he crawled back on the bed behind Toki and managed to pull a sheet up off the floor and cover the two of them with it. The lead guitarist gently placed a hand on his counterpart's abdomen, gently rubbing a finger down the muscles and making Toki shiver in response. Skisgar chuckled beneath his breath and kissed Toki's cheek. "I loves yous," he muttered before laying back down and closing his eyes. Suddenly, without barely any moment at all, a smirk formed on Toki's lips. The end. Well, that was a very erotic fanfic. Might have been a little more erotic if two women were involved, but I digress. It was still erotic nonetheless. Would the fanfic critic like this fanfic? I'm not sure, seeing I've seen her reaction to past fanfics that were of this nature. And seeing I'm not familiar with whatever this fanfic is based off of, I'm not sure if this pairing is actually legit or not. So only one can tell. All I can say is that I enjoyed it, but I'm someone who appreciates stuff like this, if you know what I mean. Well, I am Lesbian Jesus. Tune in next week and you will see our darling fanfic critic. She might not be very happy because she was going to review this fanfic herself, but I took the liberty of doing so. By the time she finds out that I did this episode, this fanfic will already be on the internet. Aren't I a stinker? Well, I have to go, so I bid you all well.